Defense industry executives and their Wall Street investors are getting really excited about the number of global crises we've got going on.
They're winners and losers. If you look at the defense stocks in America, they're the winners in this situation.
This seems to fit quite nicely with the Raytheon defense portfolio.
We're on a kind of a peacetime mindset for the last several decades. We need to ramp up to more of a wartime footing.
The unfortunate reality that conflict is good for these stocks.
Now, we're not a foreign policy organization. More Perfect Union covers the American economy with a working class lens. But here's the thing. Politicians from both parties are trying to convince us that foreign wars are good for improving America's working class.
I'm going to send to Congress an urgent budget request to support our critical partners, including Israel and Ukraine.
The supplemental the president put forward invests to ensure our military readiness and create American jobs.
The overwhelming majority has, in fact, gone to supporting American jobs.
American manufacturing, American jobs.
This supplemental does build up that industrial base.
This money is going to create jobs for Americans.
Equipment that defends America and is made in America.
This isn't a new strategy. For more than 80 years, politicians and the corporate elite have told us that war creates jobs and economic stimulus for all of us. The reality is that defense spending has become yet another mechanism by which wealth is transferred from the working class to the elites. And this one is getting people killed. It's the result of decades of consolidation, government capitulation, and the defense industry ripping off Uncle Sam with incompetence and greed. This is The Classroom from More Perfect Union. And today we're talking about war. Who is it good for?
Boys, the War Manpower Commission wants some of us to change over to war industry. Leo, you want a job? Okay with me.
When politicians say that war is good for the economy, they often evoke one specific war.
Just as in World War II, today patriotic American workers are building the arsenal of democracy.
The industrial buildup for World War II created nearly 20 million jobs and increased wages in manufacturing across industries. When the war ended, the effects stuck around. Income and wealth were more distributed, union membership and power increased, and women and Black Americans who entered the workforce during the war stayed in the workforce. And that's because President Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually pushed back against the big businesses that were building war supplies. Before World War II, there was no dedicated defense industry. So everyday industry like car makers pivoted to war supplies. FDR made it mandatory for those contractors to follow labor protection laws and respect unions, and he enforced it. Ford Motors won a contract to make military trucks, but refused the labor protections. So FDR canceled the contract. Labor historians say this led to Ford's historic unionization just months later. FDR even threatened to seize patents for big industries that weren't helping what was perceived as the national interest. There were protections in place to prevent rampant profiteering. Then, after the war, the GI Bill gave returning troops economic opportunities like college tuition and home loans. That combination of regulation and smart social spending led to good economic times for America's middle class and played a big role in why the boomer generation had it relatively easier financially. But that same time period also created the permanent defense industry. There were always war profiteers, but never an entire industry that existed for war. In 1950, the State Department, with help from the Department of Defense, put together a 66-page top-secret document called NSC 68 and presented it to President Truman. NSC 68 argued that the Soviet Union was a massive threat, and the United States needed to start spending to build up its military immediately. But beyond building up the Soviets as the enemy, the report also pointed to the, quote, lessons of World War II to justify increased military spending. It would be good for the economy, they said. That report formed the basis of America's Cold War strategy. Military spending as a percent of GDP nearly tripled in just a few months. Years later, the men who wrote the report admitted they were selling a story and bludgeoning the mind of top government into building America's military power. There was the infamous Lockheed loan, where President Nixon wrapped $250 million loan to the warplane manufacturer into a jobs bill. The Secretary of the Treasury at the time admitted the bailout was so that Lockheed could, quote, minimize losses and provide employment. In 1973, Israel was at war, and Washington was debating emergency security funding. Sound familiar? In one meeting, Nixon admitted To goose the economy, the private sector is the best place. In government, the best place is the military. His administration continued to push the point that Israel funding was good for the American economy. There was some dissent from Senator Joe Biden. Economic historian Tim Barker points to an amendment Biden suggested. It is not a proper function of the Department of Defense in determining the amount of the budget for that department for any fiscal year to make allowances for amounts needed to help stimulate or otherwise affect a change in the domestic economy. But it didn't work. The spending was approved. But the defense industry wouldn't always be flying high. In the early 90s, something terrible happened. Peace.
In Moscow, the hammer and sickle is lowered for the last time, and an era comes to an end.
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
When the Cold War ended, a major part of the dialogue is what effect it would have on the economy, specifically jobs.
What are your thoughts on what Mr. Bush had to say?
He almost does not allow himself the luxury of expressing a thought on foreign policy without quickly saying, folks, I'm also worried about the economy.
One congressman even said, the truth is, we are not prepared for peace in the world. For the first time since it was created, the war industry was in decline. But then, in 1993, one top-secret dinner party changed everything. Leadership from the Department of Defense, reacting to the spending climate, invited the executives of the nation's defense companies to a dinner at the home of Deputy Defense Secretary William Perry. He showed the executives a presentation. Big Pentagon budget cuts meant that there wouldn't be enough money to keep so many defense companies alive. They'd have to merge to survive. But get this. After a few months of lobbying by the industry, the Pentagon agreed to pay for the company's restructuring costs. Not just allowing, but encouraging the creation of near monopolies. Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta to form Lockheed Martin. Northrop merged with Grumman to form Northrop Grumman, and so on. And they just made the Pentagon pay for all the costs. Nearly $200 million in just 3 years. Eventually, 51 major companies became just 5. And the narrative that defense sales helped the economy just kept going.
I think actually the spending in the war might help with jobs. Yeah, because we're buying equipment and people are working. I think this economy is down because we built too many houses.
$110 billion, 450,000 jobs.
It's 500,000 jobs.
600,000 jobs, maybe more than that.
Lockheed Martin has brought nearly 3,000 jobs to Alabama.
I'm proud to be here to announce that Raytheon Raphael is building a new $33 million facility in East Camden. The site will create 30 new jobs.
And the contractors themselves made that argument too. William Hartung writes about Lockheed Martin's 2009 push for funding for their F-22 Raptor, with giant ads that said 300 million protected, 95,000 employed everywhere. The ads continued with breakdowns of supposed jobs per state, a clear appeal to lawmakers. If you don't give us this money, your state will lose jobs. But Hartung's research found that the job claims were grossly exaggerated. The estimates included things like staff at restaurants near weapons plants where workers could eat lunch. In 2012, Lockheed Martin threatened their own workers for political gain. They sent a memo to employees saying they'd be laid off if President Obama won because he'd cut defense spending. Look, obviously people need jobs, and defense manufacturing jobs are seen as valuable and important in key areas around the country. But let's be honest about this. Job creation is a mere afterthought. Pennies that the defense industry drops while walking away with a giant bag of loot. Let's dig in on this. Is building weapon systems actually the most effective way to create jobs and build an economy for everyone? Research at the Watson Institute of Brown University found that over the past 2 decades, the Department of Defense takes an average of $260 billion a year out of the national budget. They calculated what could have been done with that budget, jobs-wise. Spending that same amount on clean energy or healthcare would have created 50% more jobs, and education spending would have doubled the amount of new jobs. Today, all of that theory is being confirmed by economic reality. The billions we've spent in Ukraine simply aren't creating new jobs. You can even track how money going directly to specific contractors doesn't create jobs. Reporting from Common Dreams found that from 2012 to 2018, Lockheed Martin's share of the American tax dollar increased by $13 billion. But in the same time, they cut more than 16,000 jobs. The situation was similar at Boeing and Raytheon. The only companies that added jobs only did so because they sucked up smaller companies and technically added their employees to their payroll. And defense companies also don't care about the unions. Taylor Barnes at Inkstick Media reported that arms companies are constantly moving their plants to states with right-to-work laws and other weak labor protections. Big union wins from World War II aren't sticking around. Lockheed had 69% unionization in 1971 and 19% in 2022. Only 4% of Northrop Grumman workers are unionized. And the jobs aren't even staying in America. One labor leader claimed a Lockheed union negotiator said to him, "We are actively looking for ways to outsource your job." Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Justin McFarland recently told a conference of military contractors that the DoD would support flexible acquisition, which means moving some manufacturing to allies and partners. And the defense companies work real hard to keep it this way. In 2022, when then Representative Mondaire Jones introduced an amendment that would ban companies with NLRB or FLSA labor violations from getting defense contracts, the industry came out swinging to destroy it. They won and bragged about it. They'd keep their flow of government cash coming with no responsibility to respect workers' rights. And they can get away with it because of the monopoly they hold, which they also use to rip off the government and the taxpayer. A 2015 DoD review of contracts found that Lockheed Martin and Boeing were overcharging the government on a rocket program by hundreds of millions of dollars. The F-35 is another case of a legendarily ridiculous project. The government has given over $1 trillion to Lockheed Martin for a jet that just keeps having disasters, extending the length of the expensive project.
The U.S. military is scrambling to recover an F-35 stealth fighter that crashed into the South China Sea on Monday.
And they're straight up stealing, too. A government task force found tens of billions of dollars of waste, fraud, and abuse in military contracts, all in the name of building war machines. So where is all that money going? To create a risk-free investment for banks and the elite at the expense of working people, the taxpayer, and global peace. And that's not just me saying that. The Department of Defense figured it out. In April of 2023, the DoD did a report on procurement. That's what they call buying stuff. They focused on 2009 through 2019 and found a few key points. Defense company profits and margins are up, but they're not spending those gains on new technology. Research and development spending are down. But in the same time, money handed to shareholders went up by 73%. The report also finds that the defense companies generate total returns to shareholders well in excess of what one might expect given their relative low risk to investors. Translated, a not-so-risky gamble is making a small group of people a lot of money. Again, that's the Department of Defense saying that. It's research prepared for and by them. They know what's happening, and they're letting it happen. Remember those folks we heard from at the beginning of the video?
They're winners and losers.
This seems to fit quite nicely.
An important boost.
Ramp up to more of a wartime footing.
Conflict is good for these stocks.
When you hear these executives in this context, you know who they're talking to. Shareholders. That's who the defense companies are legally beholden to. Not working Americans, not the military they claim to support, and certainly not the people in the countries our military and its allies use the defense companies' products in.
The business is killing it, literally killing it.
The post-World War II economy that people look back upon wasn't from blindly pouring money into defense, but smart social and domestic spending. We should and could be investing in things that make our lives better and create good-paying unionized jobs nationwide. But we can't do that when we're clinging on to a myth sold to us by some of the wealthiest people in America, who are literally killing it. Their words, not mine. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to support more reporting like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if there's a story you want to see us cover, leave a comment below.